So today we are going to talk about coevolution. And really, when we talk about coevolution, we're really talking about this intimate partnerships. And what that refers to is a partnership between the two organisms that are co-evolving with each other, right? So if we think about that, there's a lot of interest in this particular topic from lots of different scientists because a lot of different scientists believe that to have long-term survival of organisms, that these organisms that are in these partnerships have to co-evolve with each other. They have to have certain mutations that will give them benefits over the organism that's feeding on them or preying on them. And so there's this kind of juxtapositioning of the different organisms, right? So the predator has the advantage, and then there's some kind of mutation that occurs, so now the prey has the advantage, and it goes back and forth, right? And so this is what this topic is today, and it really is pretty fascinating. So I hope you enjoy it. So if we think about this, the idea of this co-evolution, right, of this geographic mosaic hypothesis or theory, if you will, started really to take shape in the 1950s when three hunters died while at a campsite, right? And so the only weird thing they found was they found a rough-skinned newt that got into the coffee pot, right? And so evidently they made coffee. They didn't know the newt was in there, and that was the only real interesting thing that they found. So there was this biologist named Edmund Brody, and he decided to investigate, and he couldn't find anything that was really um, different other than the fact that when they started to look at this particular newt, they found out that it produced a very powerful poison, right? And so they did a little bit of work with it, and they found out that the toxin itself could slip through the nervous system through channels, and then it could paralyze the victim. So the victims really died of respiratory paralysis, right? Their body just shut down. And that was pretty interesting to think about. Now, if you think about that, there have been history of lots of different individuals using um, some of the some of the excretions from frogs and other animals as tools for hunting and things like that. But this is the first time that people started to really think about how these processes might work and why was this newt producing this particular poison, this toxin, right? And so in his investigation, Brody found that a single newt could produce enough poison to kill 100 people, and that's pretty significant. Now there are other examples of this in nature, right? And since you guys know I'm a microbiologist, the organism that produces botulinum toxin, right, Botox, 1 gram of pure botulinum toxin would be enough to take out more than 100,000 individuals, right? So these toxins are unique to nature. They're found in lots of different organisms, right? But the question still is why are they producing these toxins? What is it that why is it that these organisms that are in the secluded parts of nature, why is it that they're producing these toxins, right? And so Pete Edmund Brody postulated that potentially or maybe the those hunters died because they drank coffee with that had this newt in it, and the poison got released from the newt's skin, rough skin, and then they drank it, and then they died, right? So if they looked at the life cycle of the newt itself, and what they determined was that the newt was probably producing these poisons as a deterrent to predators, really. And so its number one predator, of course, was a garter snake, and the garter snake would prey on them, they would eat them, but the garter snakes wouldn't die, right? And so this was one of those ideas that really kind of started the whole idea of the natural arms race, or the coevolution theory, is that these organisms would produce certain chemicals or certain defense mechanisms so that they would not be destroyed by the predator, right? But then the predator would respond by having a mutation that would be favored by natural selection, and then these particular mutations would help that garter snake or whatever predator it is be more effective at hunting these organisms they preferred in their diet, right? So Brody found that the garter snake had evolved neuron channels that had a different distinctive shape. And so if you remember some of our discussions very early on in the semester, we said that with proteins, what established the protein's function was its shape. And so if you have a different shaped receptor in the neurons, the nervous system of the garter snake, then those particular toxins, those poisons, could not attach to them, could not get into the body of the garter snake, and the garter snake would not be affected, right? So in this case, that different shape of the receptors for the neurons in the garter snake would make it more difficult for that poison to get into the garter snake itself, which is really pretty interesting. Okay. Any questions so far? So there are these extreme adaptations like that we see in the rough skin newt, the poison, the toxin, right? And then the garter snake, right? So the neuron channels having a different shape over a period of time. And so we believe that, that these evolutionary changes are positioning themselves, over hundreds of thousands of years, maybe even millions of years, right? So that we have this kind of balance of who has the advantage, right? Well, in this case, the newt has the advantage over a period of time, and then the garter snake has an advantage over a period of time. But there's this kind of positioning of this advantages due to mutations, right? Because the mutations that occur at random, the ones that allow for the organism to have an advantage in nature, as we talked about throughout the entire semester, is the ones that are going to be selected for by natural selection. And so we call this the co-evolutionary arms race. So it happens in lots of different organisms that are co-evolving on our planet, right? And so it's really about this uh, prey versus predator, right? And there's lots of different examples in nature, right? And so if we think about this, we can talk about a few of these in just a second, right? But remember, natural selection is going to favor those particular mutations that allow for variations in traits in either the predator or the prey, and allow it to have an advantage, right? And so if you think about um, the prey, it's going to have an advantage to be able to escape the predator, but the predator, when a mutation occurs in it, it's going to have an advantage so it can circumvent, so it can get through the defenses of the prey, right? And the defenses that it has developed. And so just that itself is pretty powerful to think about, right? How we believe that in order for us to have the biodiversity that we have on this planet, that this constant juxtapositioning of who's got the advantage in organisms that are co-evolving with each other has to occur. Okay. And so the prey itself can further its reinforces, right, by things that will allow it to uh, evade the predator, right? And so again, these things go back and forth. And so I found this slide, and I think it makes really good sense if we just look at it for a minute, right? And so that we can see how we have these mutations that can happen, and then whether or not these mutations occur, right? Whether or not these mutations occur over a period of time it's going to be because those mutations give that organism an advantage. So if you just reflect a little bit on our course and how many times I've said that, right? Mutations occur at random, but whether or not they stay in the population, in the offspring, is going to depend on whether or not it gives the organism an advantage. Okay. Can you all see my little hand? Um, can if I move it around, can you all see it? Can you see that little hand?
I can't.
You cannot? Okay.
Mm-mm.
Let me see. How about the pointer? Can you see the pointer?
No.
You can't see the pointer. Okay. All right. Give me a second here. They've updated Blackboard, so I'm having a difficult time finding a pointer. Okay, we'll just go on. So the idea of even though Brody kind of had some ideas, that the natural arms race idea was first proposed by two different scientists, right? They were botanists, and that was Peter Raven and Paul Ehrlich, right, in 1964, and they were studying milkweed, right? So if we have milkweed growing in our backyard, and I've never really thought about milkweed this way. um, I knew that it produced this kind of milky sap-like stuff, but why did it do that, right? I never know. And I typically, you would see it kind of seep or weeping a little bit over a period of time, and I always wondered why that happened. But I wasn't that interested in it, so I never really paid too much attention to it because there's just so much things going on in nature that I like to pay attention to, right? But when they were studying the milkweed, they found out that the milkweed had defense mechanisms against insects, and so the story really about the milkweed and the insects kind of goes like this, right? So the milkweed themselves, on their pods, right, they grow these hairs to deter insects from reaching their tissues, right? Because the insects, of course, want to eat the milkweed, but the milkweed does a lot of things for other organisms like the monarch and a bunch of other things where they pollinate them. But they don't. The plants have evolved these mechanisms so that they wouldn't get consumed by the insects, right? And so if you can see this picture of the milkweed, kind of right lower lower right middle, if you will, you can see that the milkweed is there's a little bit of seepage coming out of the stem itself, and it's got this kind of milky substance coming out, right? So if an insect does get past the hairs and bites the milkweed, then a sticky white fluid oozes out of the plant, right? And so that sticky white fluid has got some chemicals in it, right? And so if the insect continues to eat on it, then that those chemicals that are in that milky white substance can kill the insect, right? And so the plant protects itself. And so that's pretty interesting to think about how that might happen, right? And there's lots of examples of this in nature, um, and not just in plants, but in other species also. Okay, so then the insects, of course, you can see the little yellow structures here are aphids, and then you can see some of the other ones are kind of um, munchers of the plants, plant hoppers, if you will. But they developed their own mechanisms to really disarm the poison. And so what they did is they could cut holes in the plant tissues that allows the sap to run through it, and then the sap wouldn't really be released. And so again, there's this juxtaposition of these two different organisms that are co-evolving with each other, and then you can see that over a period of time that it makes the biodiversity, it makes the organisms a lot more evolutionary fit, right? So Raven and Ehrlich proposed that every time the plant evolved a new defense, then the of course natural selection favored a counter defense from the insect, right? And so this led to the insect coming up with a new strategy, maybe. Of course, mutations occur at random, and then whether or not they get selected for natural selection is because there is an advantage to that particular um, mutation, right? And so if you think about it, then that would lead to the milkweed developing other defenses. And so that's really great to think about. Here's another example, right? So we have an orchid and an Iguanid wasp, right? And so the Iguanid wasp is just called, it's nicknamed the orchid duped wasp, if you will. But and we have this relationship, this coevolution between that red duped wasp, or that, I'm sorry, that orchid dupe wasp and the red-tongued orchid, right? And so if you think about it, the red-tongued orchid releases a pheromone-like substance. It's chemicals that the female red wasp would release. And so what it would do is it would entice the male wasp to release a sperm because it believes it's mating with a female, right? So it gets duped, if you will. And so that's pretty interesting to think about. And so the defense is there, of course, is there's less wasp, and if the wasp are not around, then the orchids are not damaged, right? Because the Iguanid wasp, the orchid dupe wasp is not destroying the orchids, right? But the dupe wasp don't always fall for the tricks, right? Um, the males eventually learn to just avoid the flowers, right? And so if they avoid the flowers, they're not coming in contact with that scent, and so they're not wasting sperm, right? And so that's another really cool, if you will, um, example of this natural arms race that's going on in nature. Okay, so the wasp then will in turn pass those genes off to their offspring, and so their offsprings will not be tricked by the wasp, right? And so of course that might drive mutations that might have more sophisticated defense mechanisms for the orchid against that particular wasp, right? And so this natural arms race continues on, right? And so those may develop mechanisms to which they do a better job of fooling the wasp, right? And so therefore, um, the they get pollinated by the correct type of wasp, right? And so they can continue on to pass those genes on to the offspring. So again, we believe that this natural arms race can go on for millions of years and um, can also really at some point come to an end if the two evolutionary enemies change their strategies, right? And so if there's a complete strategy change, then maybe there's no need for these mutations to continue on. Right? But again, remember, we believe that these coevolutions, these these positioning of these mutations, these adaptations that these organisms have, make them stronger in nature. So therefore, in a lot of cases, we believe that they're needed in order for these organisms to continue to survive. If we go back and just look at the milkweed one more time, right? And so if we think about this, research into the milkweed insect conflict found that plants have evolved to grow back stronger and more vigorously when they're consumed by insects. So they just don't grow their natural rate. They just simply um, grow back a lot faster, right? So there's a lot more of them. And so therefore they have defenses and the insects try to eat them, but then they just grow a lot quicker, right? And so you can see that there's another another strategy that some of the plants might have, where they just simply they the the different types of hormones needed just get released a lot quicker, and so then um, they grow a lot quicker, right? And some of these hormones or some of these growth factors are actually contained by organisms that are in the soil, right? And so just maybe understand that for a minute, right? So the milkweed might be in this relationship with these insects, but it might also be in this relationship with these soil dwelling fungi or bacteria, right, that are going to help it so that they release these different hormones, and then these different hormones allow these organisms to grow a lot quicker, right? So it's pretty interesting to think about it because it gets very complicated very quickly about how these relationships are out there in nature. So that's why the lecture today is entitled Intimate Relationships and Natural Arms Race, right? Because you got to have these relationships between the organisms in order for them to co-evolve. Okay. So therefore, milkweeds are shifting to a new strategy. They're growing faster, right? And instead of resisting the insects, the plants grow back even faster. And then when that way they respond to that that's the way they respond to being eaten, right? And so this pretty interesting thing that's going on there, and people are noticing this and they're publishing papers about it, and it's really kind of interesting to follow. I I there's this life dinner principle, and if you think about this, predators have an inherent disadvantage in the race because of the life for dinner principle, and so you should know this for the exam. And that the principle basically states that the adaptation should be stronger on the prey, right, than on the predator, because if the prey loses, it loses its life. But if the predator loses, it just loses its dinner, right? And so that's uh, that's a really cool thing to think about, right? And so there's lots of examples of this in nature when we think about larger organisms, right? Because I've been talking about insects and plants for the most part, but if we think about larger organisms, it happens there also, right? I have a video for you all. I'm not going to show it in class, but you guys can watch this if you will, and it really shows this kind of interesting phenomena that happens between ants and other organisms, and in some cases, these ants are really pulling in the organisms that feed off of them, and so these organisms release chemicals that the ants think that they are their own um, developing pupa, and so what they'll do is they'll just simply carry them to their nest when they move, right? And so the ants move ever so often so that they don't get destroyed by these predators, but so the ants are just kind of taking the predators with them, right? Unbeknownst to them, and so it's pretty interesting. So if you get a chance, take a look at it. Okay, there might be an extra credit question on the exam about the video. Let's talk about cheaters in the common, right? And so if we think about this, a long time ago, farmers were grazing cattle in public meadows that they call the common because everybody shared the particular meadow, right? And so um, over a period of a long time, the farmers would be better off if each of them grazed their cattle in the commons, but just lightly, right? So took them in there, gave them a little bit of time to have a meal, and then it would bring them back to wherever they were, right? They wouldn't let the cattle just continue to graze in the common, right? And so if we think about this, that those meadows would stay healthy for everybody who was involved, if that was followed. But an individual farmer, uh, it it had a very some of them had very short-term strategies, and so they would just simply allow cattle to eat as much as possible, get fattened up, and then they could produce more milk, or they could sell them and make more profit, right? And so we call that particular idea for those people, those farmers, to be cheaters in the common. Now, cheaters in the common is just a term that's used to talk about organisms that really kind of overdo it when they're in this relationships, right? So we're talking about these intimate relationships. And so when we talk about cheaters in the common, they're organisms that are taking more than they should, right? And so you might have family members that do that, right? They come and visit and then they stay for a lot longer than you want them to. And so they would be kind of a cheater in the common, if you will. So if everybody followed the same strategy, the commons would be overgrazed and destroyed, and then everybody would lose out, right? And so that particular idea of everybody cheating would lead to um, a known hypothesis known as the tragedy of the commons, right? So if everybody cheated, then there would be tragedy because you would lose your resource, and unfortunately, that is happening. We talked about how some of that is happening really with biodiversity. Right? So if we think about that, the humans are really the cheaters in the common, right? Because we are taking a lot more resources than kind of the rest of nature, and so we're destroying the commons, right? And so that's pretty um, uh, that's pretty profound to think about how we, even though we know about this stuff, we know about what happens when we overdo it. We're continuing to cheat, right? In the biodiversity of the planet. So if we think about it, even going further, right? There's a lot of examples, but um, if we look at, for instance, rhizobium, right, a species of soil bacteria that colonizes the roots of different plants, including legumes, right? So this is one of the organisms that we are thankful that we have, because we have bluebonnets because of rhizobium, because it helps to fix nitrogen to the roots of the plants, and then it allows the plants to take those in and use the nitrogen and convert it into different forms, amino acids, right? Which then the plants can turn into plant protein, and then lots of organisms can benefit from those particular proteins that plants have, because there are a lot of organisms that feed off of plants, right? So the best long-term strategy for this relationship, of course, is for the bacteria to keep supplying the plant with nitrogen, because if it does that, then both, this is called mutualism, right? Mutualism is defined as organisms in a relationship, and both of them benefit from the relationship mutually, right? So in this case, the plants are allowing to get that nitrogen to form amino acids and proteins, and then of course the bacteria are benefiting because they're getting sugars, plant sugars, that are being produced by photosynthesis, right? And so you can see it's mutualistic for these two organisms. So again, if you think about this, then just as I said, the bacteria are producing the nitrogen for the plants, and the plants are um, producing sugar, nutrients, sugars, glucose, and the bacteria are taking in those sugars and then producing a lot of other things, but in this case, it continued to fix nitrogen to produce nitrogen that is readily available for the plant to use, right? And the fixation of nitrogen, the changing of nitrogen from a gas to an amino group, takes a lot of energy, right? So if you think about that for just a minute, um, you can turn, if you will, nitrogen, which is N2, to, you fix it, you reduce it, and you turn it to an amino group, right? And when you do that, then the amino groups can be used to make proteins. And so you can see that the plants benefit, and then the bacteria benefit. And so we have this really beautiful relationship. Okay. So some of the bacteria, when they mutated, right, they didn't supply the plant with nitrogen, right? But they still kept taking nutrients, right? And so the bacteria are cheating, right? They're taking nutrients, but they're not giving anything back. And supposedly, what this relationship is supposed to have evolved, and so they are cheaters in the common. They're taking nutrients from the plants, but they're not providing anything back for the plant. And so you would think that natural selection would favor the cheaters, right? But that's not how it works, right? And so if we think about how that might happen, what would happen to the plant, right? The plant would eventually not be able to survive because it's not getting its nitrogen, and therefore um, they would die, right? So there's a sanction hypothesis, right? And so if we think about this, cheaters can be shut down because the plant imposes sanctions on the cheaters, right? And so there was experiments done with soybeans where they were grown in a chamber and nitrogen was placed with argon, right? So the plant could still survive, but the organisms that are supposed to produce nitrogen, rhizobium for the plants, uh, they were living off the plants themselves, but then when they got cut off, then the bacteria didn't do well, right? And so there was this sanction hypothesis where one of the organisms just really puts a stop to the organisms who are taking stuff, being cheaters, and not providing anything back to the other organism, right? And so that's pretty good. So in this way, the plants responded, so they didn't allow bacteria to form any nodules at their roots, and so um, therefore the nodules contain less oxygen that normally be there, and the plant shut down the supply of oxygen to the cheating bacteria, and then the cheating bacteria could not continue on to live there, right? Um, so it slowed them down from growing, right? There was less nodules, and therefore the bacteria had to go to another source, and they would really um, have to go back to fixing nitrogen, and so then they were really kind of working for the relationship again, and I think that's really a great story. Okay. Any questions? Anybody have any questions? So coevolution is messy, right? We have this idea of a geographic mosaic, and so if we think about this, um, uh, coevolution does not happen in a neat assembly line kind of way, right? And so there's raw ingredients for the coevolution, and that would be mutations, that would be recombination of genes. There might be other sources like viruses or whatever that bring in new genes, but it takes a long time for these things to happen. Geographic mosaic simply means that over a long period of time, within a long range, you have these co-evolutionary periods where all these organisms are co-evolving so that they become more evolutionary fit. Okay. So a particular mutation can boost fitness, right, of a particular parasite or a mutualistic organism, right? But the genetic drift can also spread these mutations that are neutral or harmful. And the natural selection may adapt one population um, to another set of local conditions. And then that local conditions, they can act very differently, going back to the idea of niches, right? Of these niches in nature, right? So then organisms can then migrate from one population to another. There can be mixing of genes, right? And so these mixing of genes kind of blur the adaptation between the co-evolutionary partners. So geographic mosaic explains that complexity, right? And co-evolutionary partners do not have the same relationship everywhere, right? They have different relationships within a range. So if you think about going back to the garter snake, right? Um, if we look at this, there might be some parts of the region where these garter snakes are where um, the garter snake has a very powerful resistance to the toxins, right? But there might be a region where the newt itself doesn't produce very much toxin, and so therefore the newt is more successful because in that region, the garter snake didn't have that adaptation, so that they had a shift in their shape of their receptor. And so if you think about that, then in some places garter snakes are going to be much more susceptible to the toxin, where in other parts of the region they're going to be much more resistant to the toxin. And that's kind of the idea of this whole geographic mosaic, right? So there are hotspots where these organisms are co-evolving very quickly. There are other cold spots where coevolution is not happening all that much, right? And so there's might be a part of the range where the species are specifically adapted to each other, right? And so there's always going to be these areas where they're mismatched, where one organism has an advantage over the other. Because remember, if you think about it over long periods of time, these mutations are going to occur. And if there are barriers between these organisms, right, different different parts of the population may be experiencing an advantage, where in other parts the prey might be experiencing the advantage. And so that's really interesting to think about. And so over a period of time, the mosaic changes, genes flow between populations, and their co-evolutionary relationship changes, right? And that's the beauty of biodiversity, right? And mutualistic organisms are not the only ones that do this. Again, so if you think about the rough skin newts and the garter snake, that relationship, right? If we look at it um, through the lens of a geographic mosaic, um, what you find out is we map the toxicity of newts and the resistance of garter snake across the United States. There's a tremendous range of the two traits. And so in some places, the newts produce a lot of toxin, right? And the snakes are very highly resistant. And therefore, um, the snakes are not really affected by the poison. In other places, the newts produce a little bit of toxin or poison, and the snakes have no resistance to it, so they garters the again the newt has the advantage, right? The garter snake dies, and so that's what I was talking about earlier, right? And so these newts and snakes are mismatched in about a third of their range, and therefore you could see that in lots of those places, snakes are highly resistant to the newts, um, but the newts produce weak poisons, right? And so there's all this type of combinations of the natural arms race that we can see throughout nature. With a change in a single amino acid, the protein, a neuron channel of the snake, can block the poison, right? On the other hand, um, the newts have to acquire a series of mutations, several of them, in order to make their poison more deadly. And so again, you can see that there's always going to be this juxtapositioning of these organisms, right? And we're talking about newts and snakes, but it happens in a lot of different organisms. So if all of the garter snakes would just simply become resistant, then the natural arms race would be over, the snakes would win, right? And so if we think about this, then no small increase in the strength of the newt's poison will make any difference, and it's less likely to be eaten. So then they would have to have a change in strategy, or eventually those newts would become extinct, right? And that is nature. In nature, almost everything is food for something else, unless you're at the top of the food chain. Okay, apex predator. So we can go back to look at some of the evolutionary periods, co-evolutionary of some of these other organisms, right? And so if we go back and look at early on when we talked about the eukaryotes and the prokaryotes and how they formed, right? And so the mitochondria began really as free living bacteria, right? And so if we go back and think about that, the mitochondria are really the eukaryotic cells. They are the what produces almost all the ATP, almost all of the energy. Um, and so they are very much shaped like bacteria. If you go in there and look at them, and you look at their structure, they're shaped just like bacteria, plus also they have their own DNA and they only have one chromosome. So there's a lot of evidence saying that these organisms, I'm sorry, these mitochondria were once bacteria, and that's called endosymbiotic theory, right? Just to go back to it, it's a really important concept. And so again, this is the coevolution of two organisms, a eukaryotic cell and a prokaryotic cell, and eventually what happened is the prokaryotic cell, the bacteria, became an endosymbiont, right? It was in a relationship with the eukaryote. It got inside the cell, and they were living together for a while. But then over a period of a whole bunch of time, the bacteria just stopped being a bacteria, and what it did is it became a specialized organelle in the eukaryotic cell. It became the mitochondria. Some bacteria, some of the cyanobacteria did this, but they became chloroplasts, right? And this endosymbiotic theory, right, basically says that the mitochondria were once bacteria, but now they're specialized organelles in eukaryotic cells, and they form most of the ATP. That whole idea is not new. There are other examples of endosymbiotic relationships. So termites can digest wood, but they cannot. I'm sorry. Termites can ingest wood, but they cannot digest it, right? And so there are bacteria and there are other protozoans, like trichonympha, that is in the termite intestines, and it has the enzymes that it can digest the wood for the termites. And so there's this relationship between these two organisms. The termite is simply feeding the organisms in its intestines, and the organisms in the intestines, the protozoan, right, trichonympha, and also the bacteria are breaking down the wood, and then all of the organisms are um, benefiting from that endosymbiotic relationship, right? So if we continue to think about that, right, there have been lots of these different instances, right? So we talked about the mitochondria in eukaryotic cells like us, but all eukaryotic cells, but specific to the plants, they're chloroplasts, right? And so if we think about this over a period of time, um, those those organisms, those cyanobacteria, have become part of the cell. They become chloroplasts, and that's where the chlorophyll is, and so that's where photosynthesis occurs. Okay. With us, um, this process happens also, right? But mostly our with our relationship with viruses. And so remember, viruses are not living, right? But in order to reproduce or replicate, they have to get into one of our cells, and it can be any organism cells, but get into a cell. They have to really just kind of take control or hijack the cell's resources to reproduce, right? So they inject their nucleic acid into the host cell. That host cell takes over. The viruses, um, their function is to infect and replicate, but when they're replicating, we then have symptomology, which then makes us sick, right? It's kind of a, if you will, it's kind of a metabolic end product of the virus replicating inside our cells. We then develop symptoms to having that type of infection, and so we get sick, right? Some of the viruses um, leave things behind, right? And so if we think about this over a period of time, our body gets through the infection, but some of the viral nucleic acid is left in our cells, and so this happens constantly, right? And so when we're born, um, our cells get changed over a period of time because our cells have some viral nucleic acid in them, and every time our cells reproduce, then those cells have also the viral nucleic acids that they leave behind. And so you might have heard that if you get chickenpox as a young person, chickenpox also produces shingles, and so as an older individual, you can get shingles, and it's a lot it's a lot worse of an infection or disease as we get older. And so that's because the chickenpox have left what we call pieces of their nucleic acid behind, and we call those pieces a prophage, right? And so those are called a prophage, and that's just pieces of nucleic acid that are left behind by the viruses, and they go dormant in us, right? And so at some point um, in our life, we get under some stress, and stress can be you're in the sun too long, or you have a lot going on in your life. Maybe you get really sick, and so that increases the activity of that viral nucleic acid, and that viral nucleic acid becomes active, and it produces more viruses, and we get sick, right? So chickenpox, shingles work that way, but so do herpes, or so does herpes, right? And so herpes, cold sores, if you will, or genital herpes. You get a cold sore, right? You have herpes for life. That's herpes simplex 1. And then, it your body clears it, but then I don't know, that was maybe in high school. But then, at spring break one day, you go to the beach and you get a little bit too much sun. That's the stress on the body, and you get a cold sore, right? And you come back from spring break, and your body clears it, and your cold sore goes away. But then at the end of the semester, you're stressed out because you have too many assignments and too many exams, and that's a stress to the body, and your cold sore comes back, right? And so this is one of those things that happens over and over and over again with people who have herpes simplex 1. So Terry Heidman, he was a researcher, right, in France, and what he basically said is that um, because he did some experiments, and what he did was he took some viral DNA out of a human cell, and he was able to revive the virus, right? And it hadn't been dead. The virus itself, it's not really alive, but it had been dormant for so long, and he figured out a way to make it come back, right? So all humans carry remnants of this virus's nucleic acid, DNA or RNA, and it helps us to understand the coevolution between us and the viruses, right? But also lots of different organisms. And so if we think about this, so unfortunately, the virus that Hyman revived belonged to a group called the retroviruses, right? And so that's the same group that HIV belongs to, right? And so retroviruses can infect a host by creating an RNA copy of their genome, and then the RNA gets turned into DNA, and then the new DNA gets inserted into host genome, and then you start to have an infection of the retrovirus, right? And so it's called a retrovirus because usually DNA gets copied to RNA, but in this case, it's a retrovirus, not because it's an old one, but because it goes backwards. It goes from RNA to DNA, right? And and so you can see that most of the virus in the retrovirity are really dangerous to the organisms they infect, right? The two examples that I use all the time are HIV, which causes, of course, AIDS, and then feline leukemia virus, which causes an AIDS-like condition in cats, right? And usually when cats get it, they live about 1 year, and then they die from something else. Humans or cats do not die from HIV or feline leukemia virus. They die because HIV and feline leukemia virus takes away their immune system, and so humans die from some other infectious disease that doesn't really cause problems in us if we have a normal, healthy immune system. But when we are infected with HIV, we don't have any way to fight it, and so therefore we die. of some other infectious disease, typically that would normally kill a human, right? They're with us all the time. They just aren't that dangerous. But if you have no immune system, then you become very, very susceptible to these simple infectious agents. Okay, so the virus hijacks the biochemistry it uses to produce new viruses. The viruses get burst out of the cell and they infect a bunch of new cells, right? So if we think about this, that retrovirus-like nucleic acid was found in the human genome, and it can be passed to lots of all the different cells that are made from that particular cell line. And so, therefore, your DNA is changed forever when you get infected by a virus. Common cold, you have a common cold, your DNA gets affected by the common cold, and you have pieces of DNA. By the time we get to be an adult in our mid 40s, our DNA is not anything. It's got so many other pieces of viral particles and things like that. So it's very different than when we started. Okay. And so that's really interesting to think about how this might happen, right? Because if we think about this, it might even be passed on to our progeny because the retroviruses can infect the cells that are our gametes, right, our ova and our sperm, and then be transferred on to our progeny. And we're still working on understanding that, right? But then if you have a fusion of the gametes, right, the virus itself can um, be given to the progeny, right, and over a course of many generations, those particular mutations in those cells, some of them will continue on to cause problems, but others of them will be just simply become inactive, right? And so if this goes back to the recruitment of genes, right? Because these viral DNA components in our cells can just be what we might call junk DNA, right? They can just be DNA that's there, but it's not really doing anything. Um, but um, but in some cases, they can um, become completely non-functional. But then they might be recruited to do something else, right, for ourselves, or maybe something negative for ourselves, right? Remember, mutations can be harmful, they can be neutral, or they can be beneficial. And so this all kind of feeds into that. Okay. So if we think about this as we begin to um, leave for the week, when Darwin first recognized coevolution, he saw its effects on separate partners. Mostly, remember, he was working with larger organisms, so he looked at flowers and bees and predators and prey. But today we can see that this natural arms race or this coevolution is occurring really at the molecular level, at our human genome level, because viruses can get in and put nucleic acid into our genome, but other organisms can do that also, right? And so bacteria and other things, right? And so our story is not done, um, but it's pretty interesting to continue to understand it a little better and talk about it, right? So on Monday, we will be talking about um, hominoid speciation,